It was one of those hazy, burnt orange sunsets in Los Angeles that made the city feel like it was holding its breath. Victoria Pierce sat on the balcony of her high-rise apartment, a glass of expensive Merlot balanced in her hand, staring down at the grid of city lights below. She should have been happy. After all, she had everything. A thriving career as a celebrity PR agent, a luxurious penthouse in the heart of the city, and James. James Weston was the kind of man who turned heads the moment he walked into a room. He had that effortless charm, the kind you couldn't fake if you tried, and a smile that could unhinge even the most resolute hearts. They were the golden couple, gracing red carpets and society columns as if they'd been born for it. But something had shifted lately. Victoria felt it in the way his touch lingered a second too long when he was distracted, or in the muffled phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room. The first real crack in their perfect facade came 3 weeks ago, at a charity gala. James had excused himself to take a phone call, nothing unusual. But when Victoria wandered toward the terrace for fresh air, she saw him, not talking, kissing. A woman with fiery red hair and an emerald green dress clung to him as though the world would end if she let go. Victoria froze. The rational part of her brain told her to storm over, confront him, cause a scene. But instead, she stayed in the shadows, silent, her heart hammering so loud she thought they might hear it. Victoria didn't confront James that night. Instead, she began to dig. She wasn't the kind of woman who let her world crumble without understanding every fracture. Over the next few weeks, she tracked his movements with the precision of a private investigator. Late-night calls, unaccounted hours, credit card charges at boutique hotels. And always that same woman, Isabel Reed. Isabel was everything Victoria wasn't. She was wild, untamed, the kind of person who laughed too loud and didn't care who was watching. She'd met James at some art gallery opening. Victoria found that out through a casual question to a mutual acquaintance. The knowledge burned, but it wasn't enough to unravel her. What was unraveling, however, was James. Victoria watched him spiral under the weight of his own lies. His once flawless facade began to crack. Missed appointments, stammering excuses, and an edge of paranoia every time Victoria's phone buzzed. She kept up her own act, playing the devoted partner, but inside, she was plotting. The game wasn't about catching him anymore. It was about what she would do when the truth was undeniable. One night, Victoria finally made her move. She hosted a dinner party, a casual gathering of their closest friends in the industry. Everything was perfect. The food catered from the hottest restaurant in town, the wine flowing freely, the laughter hiding the tension she felt in every bone. Halfway through the night, Victoria excused herself, leaving James to entertain the guests. In her office, she opened her laptop and clicked on a folder marked simply James. Inside was everything. Photos, receipts, messages she'd forwarded from his phone when he'd left it unattended. The crown jewel was a video. Isabel and James, locked in an embrace in a hotel lobby, time-stamped just 3 days ago. Victoria's finger hovered over the trackpad. She could send it to every guest at the party right now if she wanted to. Blow up his world in one glorious moment. But she didn't. Not yet. Victoria wasn't finished playing. As she returned to the party, she found James's eyes on her, searching, nervous. She smiled sweetly, handing him a fresh glass of wine. "To us," she said, her voice dripping with sincerity. "To us," he echoed, his tone faltering. But Victoria knew the truth, and she wasn't just going to end this chapter. She was going to rewrite the whole story. The next morning, Victoria's plan moved into its second phase. She had hired a discreet investigator weeks ago, someone who had no connection to her or James. The man, Carl Harrison, was a former detective with a knack for uncovering hidden truths. His latest report sat on her desk, thick with photos and detailed notes about Isabel. Victoria pored over the file, learning everything she could about the woman who had upended her life. Isabel wasn't just some random fling. She had a history of entangling herself with wealthy, powerful men. There were whispers of a similar affair 2 years ago with a tech mogul that had ended in scandal. Victoria's instincts told her Isabel was playing a long game, but she needed proof. Victoria's next step was to stage a chance meeting. She had Carl find out Isabel's favorite coffee shop, a small, trendy spot in Silver Lake. Armed with a designer purse and her most disarming smile, Victoria walked in one afternoon and spotted Isabel almost immediately. The redhead was sitting by the window, sipping an oat milk latte and flipping through a fashion magazine. "Excuse me," Victoria said, flashing her brightest smile. "I couldn't help but notice your dress. Is it vintage?" Isabel looked up, startled, but then her expression softened. "It is," she said, her voice warm. "Got it at a boutique downtown." Victoria slid into the seat across from her. "I love it. You have great taste." She extended a hand. "I'm Victoria, by the way." "Isabel?" the woman replied, shaking her hand. Victoria's heart raced, but her exterior remained calm. She could sense Isabel's guard was down, her ego flattered by the attention. Over the next hour, Victoria skillfully steered the conversation, extracting details about Isabel's life without revealing too much of her own. By the time they parted ways, Victoria had secured Isabel's phone number and an invitation to a gallery opening the following week. As Victoria walked back to her car, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The pieces were falling into place. Isabel had no idea she was walking into a trap, and James, well, he was already ensnared. Victoria wasn't just playing a game anymore. She was orchestrating a masterpiece. The night of the gallery opening arrived, and Victoria made sure she looked flawless. Her sleek black dress hugged her frame perfectly, and the diamonds at her neck caught the gallery lights just enough to draw attention. She spotted Isabel almost immediately, standing with a group of artists and influencers near a large abstract painting. James wasn't there yet, but Victoria knew he would show. He always did, drawn like a moth to the flame. Victoria approached Isabel with practiced ease. "Isabel?" she called out warmly, as though greeting an old friend. Isabel turned, a smile lighting up her face. "Victoria, you made it," Isabel said, genuinely pleased. "Of course," Victoria replied. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." She glanced around. "This place is incredible. Do you know the artist?" Isabel launched into a story about how she had met the painter at a retreat in Napa Valley, her enthusiasm infectious. Victoria nodded along, her mind calculating. She knew James would arrive any minute now, and the real show would begin. As if on cue, James entered the gallery, his tall figure instantly commanding attention. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Isabel first. Then, as if sensing something amiss, his gaze shifted and found Victoria. His expression froze, a mix of shock and dread flashing across his face. Victoria smiled serenely, lifting her glass of champagne in a silent toast. The game was about to reach its crescendo, but just as James began walking toward them, a loud commotion erupted at the entrance. A man in a tailored suit stormed in, his voice booming. "Isabel, I've been trying to reach you." Everyone turned to look. Isabel's face went pale as the man approached. He was tall, his presence intimidating, and his sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on her. "We need to talk. Now." Victoria's heart raced. This was unexpected. She caught James's confused expression, and for the first time, Isabel looked completely cornered. "Nathan," Isabel stammered, stepping back. "This isn't the time." "Oh, it's exactly the time," Nathan said, his tone icy. He turned to the crowd. "Did she tell you about her little business ventures? Or the way she's been siphoning money from people like you?" Victoria's mind spun. This was a twist she hadn't anticipated, but it was playing perfectly into her hands. She stepped closer to James, leaning in as if to comfort him. "What's going on?" she whispered, her voice laced with feigned concern. James didn't respond, his eyes glued to the unfolding scene. Isabel was stammering denials, but the room's energy had shifted. Whispers spread like wildfire, and Nathan's accusations grew louder. It was clear Isabel's carefully crafted image was crumbling. Victoria took a step back, letting the chaos swirl around her. She caught James's eye again, his face a mask of confusion and fear. Slowly, She lifted her phone, subtly showing him the folder labeled James that was still open. His eyes widened as he realized what she was holding. She smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that sent a shiver down his spine. The game had taken a new turn, but Victoria was still in control. And she wasn't done yet. Victoria watched as Isabel's veneer crumbled further. Nathan's accusations didn't just draw stares. They began pulling at the threads of Isabel's entire identity. People in the crowd whispered names, wondering aloud if Nathan's claims connected to other rumors. Victoria moved strategically, mingling with groups, inserting the right words into the conversation to amplify the speculation. But the most exquisite moment came when Nathan addressed James directly. "I hear you're involved too," he said, his voice loud enough to silence the room again. "How much has she pulled from your accounts? Or are you too blinded to notice?" James stiffened, glancing rapidly between Isabel and Nathan. Isabel's pleas grew desperate. "Nathan, stop. Please. This is a misunderstanding." "No," Victoria interjected, her voice calm yet carrying authority. All eyes turned to her. She stepped forward, her calm demeanor contrasting the chaos. "It's not a misunderstanding. I've seen enough to know he's telling the truth." Isabel looked like she'd been struck. "Victoria, you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Victoria said smoothly. Her gaze lingered on James, who looked frozen in place, his expression unreadable. Then she turned to Nathan. "Thank you for shedding light on this. I think the party is over for some of us." The tension in the air was palpable as Victoria walked away, the faint sound of murmured conversations behind her. She felt James's gaze burning into her back, but she didn't turn around. There was more to do, more pieces to move, and she wasn't about to let her momentum falter. Isabel's voice turned almost hysterical, her hands reaching out as if trying to physically pull James back to her. "James, no, you have to believe me. This is all a setup. They're twisting everything to make me look guilty." James hesitated, his gaze flickering between Isabel and Victoria. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, his jaw tightening as though he was wrestling with his own thoughts. Nathan didn't miss a beat. "A setup?" he scoffed. "That's rich coming from you. How many times have you manipulated the truth to suit your story? How many people have you left in the dust while you climbed your way up?" The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, like waves building to a crest. Some of them were nodding, others whispering furiously to each other. Isabel's face crumbled further as the room seemed to turn against her in real time. Victoria took a measured step closer, her expression calm but commanding. "This isn't just about rumors anymore," she said, her voice slicing through the noise like a blade. "There's too much at stake to let this continue unchecked." Isabel's desperation turned to anger, her voice shaking but louder now. "You don't know what you're talking about, Victoria. This is just another one of your power plays. Don't act like you're the hero here." Victoria tilted her head, a faint, almost pitying smile curling her lips. "Oh, Isabel, this isn't a game anymore. You made sure of that when you started taking things that didn't belong to you." The room fell silent again, all eyes fixated on the two women. James finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Isabel, tell me the truth. Did you take money from me?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine. Isabel froze, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The silence was louder than any answer she could have given. Nathan crossed his arms, his voice dripping with vindication. "I think that says it all, doesn't it?" Victoria turned, her job done for now, and began walking away. She didn't look back, but her mind was already racing ahead. The game wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, and if she played her cards right, she'd be the one to decide how it all ended. As Victoria left the room, the faint hum of whispered accusations followed her, fading into the distance. She could feel James's gaze burning into her back, but she refused to acknowledge it. Let him stew in his doubts, she thought. The seeds had been planted, and the cracks in Isabel's carefully curated facade were widening with every passing second. Out in the hallway, She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving deftly across the screen. A few carefully crafted messages, anonymous tips to certain key individuals, and the storm would grow even fiercer. Isabel had always underestimated her, mistaking her silence for submission. But Victoria had learned long ago that power wasn't about shouting the loudest. It was about controlling the narrative. Suddenly, a voice called out behind her. "Victoria." She paused, her heart skipping a beat, but her face remained composed as she turned to see James standing there. His expression was unreadable, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What exactly are you trying to do?" he asked, his voice low but heavy with accusation. Victoria raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "I'm not trying to do anything, James. I'm just exposing the truth." "Don't give me that," he snapped. "You've been pulling strings all night. I know you have." "Why?" Victoria sighed, tilting her head slightly. "James, you're smarter than this. Isabel isn't who you think she is. She's been lying to you, using you. Don't let your feelings cloud your judgment." "And you're any better?" he countered, his voice rising. "You've been working behind the scenes, whispering in people's ears, twisting the knife. What's your angle, Victoria? What do you get out of this?" For a moment, she considered telling him the truth about Isabel's betrayals, about the schemes she'd uncovered. But she knew it wouldn't matter. James was too entangled in his feelings to see clearly. Instead, she smiled faintly, her voice calm and measured. "My angle, James, is that I don't like seeing people like her get away with things. That's all." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the dimly lit hallway. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing like a metronome counting down to Isabel's inevitable fall. As she exited the building, the cold night air hit her face, sharp and invigorating. Victoria inhaled deeply, a small smile playing on her lips. The game was far from over. Isabel might have been the first target, but there were others, and Victoria had no intention of stopping until she dismantled every piece of the corrupt puzzle that surrounded her. For now, though, she would wait. The next move was hers to make, and she intended to play it flawlessly. Victoria stepped into the night, the cool air wrapping around her like a shroud of calm after the storm she had unleashed. She glanced at her phone, scrolling through her messages. The digital whispers she'd sent out earlier were already bearing fruit. Responses trickled in, confirming what she'd expected. The rumors were spreading, and with them, Isabel's reputation was crumbling in real time. But there was no satisfaction in standing still. Victoria hailed a cab, slipping into the back seat and giving the driver a destination that wasn't her home. The night wasn't over, and there were still pieces of the puzzle she needed to move. Across the city, Isabel sat in the ruins of her carefully built world. The party had dispersed, leaving only a hollow silence in its wake. James had stormed out without a word, leaving her alone to face the reality of what had just happened. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a drink, the clink of glass against the decanter the only sound in the room. She replayed the events in her mind, her thoughts a chaotic whirl of anger, fear, and disbelief. Nathan's accusations had been like knives, but it was Victoria's cold, calculated betrayal that cut the deepest. She had trusted Victoria, or at least believed they had an unspoken truce. But tonight had proved otherwise. Isabel's phone buzzed, breaking her spiral of thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up. The screen showed a message from an unknown number. "You should have been more careful. V*****. Isabel's breath hitched, and she slammed the phone onto the table. Her heart pounded as the realization sank in. This wasn't over. Victoria wasn't just trying to expose her. She was playing a long game, and Isabel was now firmly in her crosshairs. "No," Isabel whispered to herself, standing abruptly. She wouldn't go down without a fight. Victoria might have the upper hand now, but Isabel knew how to survive. She'd done it before, and she'd do it again. If Victoria wanted a war, she'd get one. Meanwhile, Victoria arrived at her next destination, a quiet bar tucked away in a corner of the city where discretion was currency. She slid into a booth in the back, where a man was waiting for her. His sharp suit and watch spoke of wealth, but the tension in his posture revealed someone who wasn't entirely comfortable with the meeting. "Ms. Hall," he greeted her, his voice cautious. "You said you had information." Victoria smiled, sliding a folder across the table. "I do, and I think you'll find it very enlightening." The man hesitated before opening the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. As he read, his expression darkened, and he looked up at her, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Where did you get this? Does it matter?" Victoria replied smoothly. "What matters is what you do with it. I think you'll agree that Isabel isn't the kind of person you want representing your interests." He leaned back, his jaw tight. "And what do you want in return?" "Just your cooperation," Victoria said. "When the time comes, I'll need your voice to amplify the truth. That's all." The man studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Fine, but if this backfires..." "It won't," Victoria interrupted, standing. "As long as you hold up your end, everything will fall into place." She left the bar, the man still sitting there with the folder in his hands. Outside, she paused, her phone vibrating again. Another message, this time from one of her other contacts. "Nathan's stirring things up again. People are asking questions. What's the plan?" ***. Victoria smiled, typing out a response. "Let them ask. The more they dig, the less they'll trust Isabel. Keep the pressure on. ***. As she slipped her phone back into her pocket, Victoria couldn't help but feel a spark of exhilaration. The game was in full swing, and every move she made brought her closer to her goal. Isabel had underestimated her, but that mistake would cost her everything. And Victoria wasn't about to stop until every loose end was tied and the board was entirely hers. Victoria walked down the dimly lit street, her heels clicking with deliberate precision against the pavement. She thrived in moments like this, the quiet aftermath of chaos, where she could see the ripple effects of her actions unfolding. Every step she took felt like a calculated move on the chessboard she had so expertly set up. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. "James, we need to talk." For a moment, she paused, considering her options. James was a critical piece in this game, an emotional wild card with enough power to either help her cement Isabel's downfall or complicate her plans entirely. She smirked, typing back a succinct response. "Victoria, of course. Where and when?" ***. She pocketed the phone and continued walking, already thinking 2 steps ahead. James's loyalty to Isabel was waning, but it wasn't gone yet. He needed one final push, a moment of clarity that would sever his ties to her completely, and Victoria knew exactly how to orchestrate it. Back at Isabel's apartment, the air was thick with tension. She paced the room, her mind racing through possible ways to salvage her position. The fallout from tonight's debacle was already spreading. Her phone had been bombarded with messages, some from allies offering weak reassurances, others from those who smelled blood in the water and were distancing themselves. The only person she hadn't heard from yet was James. That silence stung more than anything else. Her thoughts were interrupted by another buzz. This time, it wasn't a message but a call. She glanced at the name on the screen, Nathan. Her hand hesitated over the phone, torn between the desire to ignore him and the need to confront him. She answered, "What do you want?" "Isabel." Nathan's voice was smooth, but there was an edge of mockery to it. "You didn't think I'd let you off that easily, did you?" She clenched her jaw. "You've made your point. Publicly humiliating me wasn't enough." "Oh, I think we're far from done," Nathan said. "You see, there's something satisfying about watching you squirm. But I have to admit, Victoria's performance tonight, that was the real masterpiece." Isabel's grip on the phone tightened. "She's using you, Nathan, just like she's using everyone else. Don't think for a second that she cares about you or whatever truth you think you're exposing." Nathan chuckled. "Maybe she is. But here's the thing. You've burned enough bridges that people are more than happy to believe the worst about you. And I don't think you have the cards left to stop her." The call ended before Isabel could respond. She let out a frustrated cry, hurling the phone onto the couch. Nathan was right. Victoria had played her hand perfectly, and Isabel was running out of allies. But there was one thing Victoria hadn't accounted for: desperation. Desperate people didn't follow the rules. Later that night, Victoria sat in a quiet cafe, waiting for James to arrive. She sipped her tea, her demeanor calm and collected, though her mind was already rehearsing the conversation she was about to have. When James finally walked in, she noticed the strain in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged slightly as if he carried the weight of the world. He sat across from her, his expression guarded. "Victoria." "James," she greeted, her voice soft but deliberate. "Thank you for meeting me." He didn't respond immediately, instead studying her as though trying to read her intentions. "I want to know the truth," he said finally. "All of it. No games, no manipulation, just the truth." Victoria leaned back slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "The truth," she repeated. "The truth is, Isabel has been lying to you for years. She's siphoned money from your accounts, manipulated your connections, and built her success on a foundation of deceit. You've been her safety net, James, and she's never hesitated to use you." James's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Victoria continued, her voice softening just enough to seem sincere. "I know it's hard to hear. I know you care about her, but you deserve better than this. You deserve the truth." "And what about you?" he asked, his tone sharp. "You've been pulling the strings this whole time, haven't you? What do you get out of this?" Victoria tilted her head slightly, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Justice, James. Isabel has hurt too many people for too long. If exposing her means I have to get my hands dirty, so be it. I can live with that. The question is, can you?" James exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can trust you," he admitted. "But I can't ignore what I've seen tonight. That's all I ask," Victoria said, her voice steady. "Look at the evidence. Make your own decision. But don't let her drag you down with her." As James stood to leave, Victoria watched him closely. The doubt in his eyes was unmistakable, but so was the flicker of resolve. She knew she'd planted a seed, and now she just had to wait for it to grow. Once he was gone, Victoria allowed herself a small smile. The board was set, the pieces moving exactly as she intended. The endgame was approaching, and she was ready to claim her victory. Victoria left the cafe shortly after James, her mind already plotting her next move. She'd planted the necessary seeds of doubt in him, but she couldn't rely on him to act decisively just yet. Isabel's grip on him was emotional, and emotions were unpredictable. If Victoria wanted to dismantle Isabel entirely, she needed to tighten the net further. Isabel wasn't sleeping. She hadn't slept since the disastrous party, and her exhaustion was evident in her every move. The once flawless sheen of her life was cracking, and she felt it acutely. Her phone vibrated on the table again. Another notification she didn't want to see. This time it was from an old associate, someone she'd worked with during her rise. "Isabel, I'm hearing some unsettling things. Call me." She slammed the phone down, her hands shaking. How had Victoria managed this? The sheer precision of the attack was almost impressive. Almost. Isabel had spent years building herself into someone untouchable, or so she thought. Now the walls were closing in, and the pressure was suffocating. She stood abruptly, pacing her living room. She needed to act, but her options were limited. Victoria had turned Nathan against her. James was slipping from her grasp, and the social tide was shifting. Then a thought struck her, a card she hadn't yet played. One Victoria might not see coming. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. Well, the man on the other end drawled. "If it isn't Isabel, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need your help," Isabel said, her tone curt. A pause. "Help? That's new. Last I checked, you were the one holding all the cards." "Things have changed," she admitted. "And if you're smart, you'll realize this is an opportunity for both of us." The man laughed softly. "Interesting. Tell me more. Victoria, meanwhile, was in her element. Her next meeting was with a reporter, one she trusted to handle things discreetly. She handed over a flash drive containing everything she'd gathered on Isabel. Financial records, falsified contracts, and evidence of manipulation. It was a collection of truths Isabel had buried deep, but Victoria had dug them all up. "Run with it," she said simply. "You'll find corroborating sources, and I guarantee people will talk." Isabel's made a lot of enemies. The reporter, a sharp-eyed woman with an air of determination, nodded. "If this pans out, it's going to be explosive." "That's the idea," Victoria replied, standing. "Keep me updated." As she walked out of the meeting, she felt the familiar rush of satisfaction. She wasn't just dismantling Isabel's empire, she was ensuring it couldn't be rebuilt. But Isabel wasn't idle. Her call had set something in motion. That night, she met with the man she'd reached out to, an old ally with a knack for finding leverage where others saw nothing. They sat in a darkened bar, far from the usual haunts of their social circle. "I've done some digging of my own," he said, sliding a folder across the table to her. "Victoria's not as clean as she'd like people to think." Isabel's eyes narrowed as she opened the folder. Inside were photos, documents, and a few cryptic notes. It wasn't as damning as what Victoria had on her, but it was enough to cause trouble if used strategically. "Interesting," Isabel murmured, a faint smile creeping onto her lips. "This might be exactly what I need." Her ally leaned back, watching her carefully. "Be careful with this, Isabel. Victoria's dangerous in her own way. She doesn't leave loose ends." "Neither do I," Isabel said firmly, closing the folder. "She thinks she's won, but she doesn't know who she's dealing with." The next morning, Victoria woke to an unexpected development. Her phone buzzed with messages, each one more urgent than the last. As she scanned through them, she realized something troubling. Isabel had made a counterplay. A statement had been released online, with Isabel painting herself as the victim of a targeted smear campaign. It was vague enough to avoid direct accusations, but laced with implications that Victoria's hands weren't clean. Alongside the statement were hints of Victoria's own past. Nothing concrete, but enough to raise questions. Victoria's jaw tightened as she read. Isabel wasn't retreating. She was fighting back. Good, Victoria thought. Let her try. This game wasn't over yet, and Victoria had never been one to fold under pressure. Isabel had just made her next move, and now it was Victoria's turn to respond. The board was still in play, and Victoria intended to win. Victoria stood by the window of her apartment, the early morning light casting long shadows across the room. The statement Isabel had released was playing out exactly as she expected. Vague, defensive, and full of emotional appeals. But what caught Victoria's attention wasn't the statement itself. It was the traction it was gaining. People were sharing it, some expressing sympathy, others skepticism. This wasn't just damage control. It was a carefully crafted counterattack. Isabel was digging her heels in, trying to shift the narrative before Victoria could deliver the finishing blow. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Nathan. "Have you seen her statement? It's gaining momentum. People are asking questions about you now. What's the plan?" Victoria's lips curled into a faint smirk as she typed her response. "Let them ask. It's time to turn this into a spectacle they won't forget. Meet me later." Across the city, Isabel was sitting in her office, her confidence beginning to rebuild. The response to her statement was giving her a lifeline, and she intended to use it. The folder her ally had given her lay open on her desk, the documents within sparking ideas for her next move. She turned to her assistant. "I want a press release drafted by noon. Emphasize the personal toll this campaign against me has taken, and make sure to include subtle references to Victoria's own questionable past." The assistant hesitated. "Do you think that's wise? If we go after her directly?" "Victoria started this," Isabel snapped. "She wanted a war, and now she has one. Make it happen." As the assistant left, Isabel leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She'd always prided herself on her ability to outmaneuver her enemies, and Victoria would be no exception. But deep down, a flicker of doubt remained. Victoria's precision, her calculated steps. It all felt too deliberate, as if she'd anticipated every move Isabel would make. Still, Isabel wasn't about to back down. She'd built her life on survival, and she wasn't about to let Victoria tear it apart. Later that evening, Nathan met Victoria at a quiet rooftop bar. The city stretched out below them, its lights twinkling like a sea of stars. Victoria was already seated, a glass of wine in her hand, her expression as composed as ever. "You're remarkably calm for someone whose name is being dragged through the mud," Nathan said as he sat across from her. Victoria took a sip of her wine before replying. "Calm is how you win, Nathan." Isabel's panicking. Her statement might seem like a smart move, but it's riddled with holes. "We're going to exploit every one of them." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to do that?" Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice low and deliberate. "First, we'll leak the evidence. All of it. Not just the financials, but every shred of proof we have that shows how she's manipulated people. Then we'll go after her credibility. The more inconsistencies we highlight in her story, the less people will believe her." Nathan nodded slowly, impressed by her resolve. "And what about the questions being raised about you?" Victoria smiled faintly. "Let them come. There's nothing in my past that can't be explained or spun if necessary. Isabel's trying to make this personal, but the more she focuses on me, the less she can defend herself. She's playing defense, Nathan. That's a losing strategy." He leaned back, studying her. "You've really thought this through." "Of course I have," she said smoothly. "Isabel thinks this is about reputation, about winning the court of public opinion. But she doesn't understand the game she's in. It's not about who the public sides with. It's about who's left standing when the dust settles." The next day, the leak hit the media like a bombshell. Every piece of evidence Victoria had gathered was released anonymously, accompanied by a damning exposé detailing Isabel's schemes. The financial records, the falsified contracts, the manipulative tactics. It was all there, laid out in brutal clarity. Social media exploded. Isabel's supporters scrambled to defend her, but the sheer weight of the evidence made it impossible to ignore. Her name trended for all the wrong reasons, and the whispers turned into a roar. Victoria watched it unfold from her office, her expression unreadable. She knew this wasn't the end. Isabel wouldn't go down without a fight, but the momentum was on her side now, and with every passing hour, Isabel's empire crumbled further. Isabel, meanwhile, was in damage control mode. Her team worked frantically to craft responses, but the leaks had left them overwhelmed. She felt like she was drowning, every attempt to regain control slipping through her fingers. But she wasn't done yet. Desperation gave her clarity, and she realized there was only one way to turn the tide. She needed to strike directly at Victoria. That night, Isabel made another call, this time to someone who owed her a favor, a fixer with a knack for digging up dirt no one else could find. "I need everything you can get on Victoria Hall," she said, her voice cold. "Every secret, every mistake. Leave no stone unturned." The fixer chuckled. "You're playing with fire, Isabel. Are you sure you're ready for what I might find?" "I don't care," Isabel said firmly. "If she wants to destroy me, I'll make sure she burns with me." The war was far from over, and both women knew it. But Victoria was always 3 moves ahead, and Isabel was running out of pieces to play. The tension between Isabel and Victoria reached a fever pitch. Both women, brilliant in their own right, were locked in a battle that would leave one standing victorious while the other faced utter ruin. The game wasn't just about power anymore, it was about survival. Victoria stood in her office, her gaze fixed on the city skyline. The leaks had accomplished their purpose, and the fallout for Isabel was immense. But Victoria knew better than to grow complacent. Isabel wasn't the type to lie down and accept defeat. Her phone rang, breaking the silence. She answered without looking at the caller ID. "Victoria, it's me." Nathan's voice came through, low and cautious. "I just got word Isabel's digging into your past. She's hired someone serious. Someone with a reputation for finding things people don't want found. Victoria's grip on the phone tightened. I expected as much. She's predictable when she's cornered. This isn't just some surface-level stuff, Nathan pressed. If there's anything buried, anything, she'll find it. Victoria took a breath, her voice calm but edged with steel. Nathan, if there was something to find, don't you think I'd have handled it by now? Nathan hesitated, then sighed. I hope you're right. Just watch your back. She's desperate. Victoria ended the call and leaned back in her chair. Nathan's warning didn't rattle her, but it did force her to reevaluate. Isabel's desperation made her dangerous, and dangerous people made mistakes, but only if pushed the right way. Meanwhile, Isabel sat across from her fixer in a nondescript apartment, the glow of a laptop illuminating the space. The fixer, a wiry man with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, was typing furiously. Victoria Hall, he muttered, scrolling through files and data. Clean on the surface, but there's always something deeper. Everyone has skeletons, Isabel. It's just a matter of finding the right closet. Hurry up, Isabel snapped. I don't have time for your theatrics. The fixer smirked but kept working. After several tense minutes, he leaned back, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. Bingo! Looks like your friend Victoria has a few skeletons of her own. Isabel leaned forward, her pulse quickening. What is it? Financial irregularities from a few years ago, he said, spinning the laptop to face her. Minor discrepancies in her investment portfolio, offshore accounts, assets that don't quite match up. Could be innocent, but with the right spin, it could look very suspicious. Isabel's lips curved into a cold smile. Perfect. Can you package it so it's credible? Already ahead of you, the fixer replied. Give me a day, and this will hit the media like a tidal wave. Isabel nodded, the fire in her eyes reigniting. Victoria might have landed the first blows, but Isabel wasn't out of the fight yet. The next morning, Victoria woke to headlines that made her blood run cold. Victoria Hall, financial powerhouse or master manipulator? Offshore secrets, uncovering the hidden wealth of Victoria Hall. The articles were speculative but damning, full of insinuations that painted her as corrupt. Social media was ablaze with commentary, and her inbox was flooded with requests for statements. Victoria read through the accusations, her expression unreadable. She knew the allegations were weak, fragments twisted into a narrative designed to sow doubt. But public perception was a fickle thing, and Isabel had played her card well. Her phone buzzed, and Nathan's name appeared on the screen. She answered. Victoria, what the hell is going on? He demanded. People are starting to question everything. Even the leaks about Isabel are getting buried under this. Victoria's voice was calm. This is her move, Nathan. It's exactly what I expected. And what's your move? He asked, his tone urgent. Victoria allowed herself a small, cold smile. We let her believe she's winning, just for a moment. By evening, Victoria had turned the tide once again. She issued a formal statement, addressing the allegations with confidence and clarity. Her tone was measured, her words precise. These accusations are baseless, she said in a live interview. I've built my career on integrity, and anyone who knows me understands that. What we're seeing is a smear campaign from someone desperate to deflect from their own wrongdoing. Victoria didn't stop there. She released documents disproving the claims and pointed out the suspicious timing of the accusations, framing them as a transparent attempt to discredit her amidst Isabel's scandal. The narrative shifted. People began questioning Isabel's motives, and her credibility took another hit. Victoria watched it unfold with satisfaction. Isabel had overplayed her hand. But Isabel wasn't done. That night, she made another call, to someone Victoria would never expect. James, I know you're angry at me, Isabel said when he answered, and I don't blame you, but you need to hear me out. James's voice was cold. Why should I? Because Victoria isn't who you think she is, Isabel said, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. She's been lying to you, to everyone, and I have proof. James hesitated. What proof? Meet me, Isabel said. I'll show you everything. You deserve to know the truth. James agreed reluctantly, and as Isabel ended the call, she allowed herself a grim smile. If she could turn James against Victoria, it might be enough to tip the scales. Victoria, ever aware of the shifting dynamics, knew Isabel wasn't finished. She could feel the pieces moving on the board, but she wasn't worried. Isabel was running out of options, and desperation always led to mistakes. The endgame was near, and Victoria was ready. The final move would be hers, and it would be decisive. The battle between Victoria and Isabel reached its crescendo. The tension that had simmered for weeks was now an inferno, threatening to engulf both women. But Victoria, ever the strategist, had already planned her final move. #Isabel's Gambit. The meeting with James was Isabel's last hope. She needed to win him over, to plant the seeds of doubt deep enough to turn him against Victoria. She met him at a quiet restaurant, choosing a booth in the corner to avoid prying eyes. James arrived, his expression wary. He sat down without a word, and Isabel wasted no time, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were the documents her fixer had uncovered, Victoria's alleged financial irregularities, the offshore accounts, and a carefully written narrative tying them together. "This is the real Victoria," Isabel said, her voice soft but urgent. "She's not the saint she pretends to be. She's manipulative, ruthless, and she's using you, James." James frowned, flipping through the papers. "And you're not manipulative, Isabel? After everything Nathan said, after everything that's come out about you." Isabel flinched but recovered quickly. "I've made mistakes," she admitted. "But Victoria, she's orchestrated this whole thing. She's tearing me down to cover up her own crimes." James's expression hardened, but he said nothing. Isabel pressed on, her voice breaking. "Please, James, I know I've hurt you, but I need you to believe me. You're the only one who can stop her." Victoria's Endgame. Victoria, of course, had anticipated Isabel's move. She knew James would be Isabel's target, and she had made her own preparations. While Isabel was busy spinning her story, Victoria had arranged a meeting of her own, with the fixer Isabel had hired. Money talked, and Victoria had made sure to outbid Isabel. By the time the fixer walked into her office, he was already on her side. "You've been busy," Victoria said, leaning back in her chair as the fixer handed over a second folder. This one containing the full scope of Isabel's dealings with him. "This is good. Very good." The folder included not only Isabel's request to dig into Victoria's past, but also evidence of Isabel's attempts to fabricate information and manipulate her narrative. Victoria now had the final piece she needed to destroy Isabel completely. The final blow. The next morning, a new wave of headlines hit the media. Isabel Reyes, the mastermind behind the lies. Leaked emails reveal fabrication of evidence against Victoria Hall. Exclusive. Isabel's attempts to sabotage Victoria exposed. The evidence Victoria released was devastating. Screenshots of Isabel's communications with the fixer, financial records showing her payments for falsified information, and even a recording of the fixer admitting to his role in Isabel's schemes. All of it was made public. The narrative shifted irrevocably. Isabel was no longer a victim but a manipulative force who had gone to extreme lengths to destroy Victoria. Public opinion turned against her like a tidal wave, and her allies abandoned her one by one. James, who had seen both sides, confronted Isabel after the revelations. "Was any of it real?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet anger. "Or was I just another pawn to you?" Isabel tried to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She realized, too late, that there was nothing she could say to undo the damage. Victoria's victory. As Isabel's world crumbled, Victoria emerged stronger than ever. She had not only defended herself but solidified her reputation as a powerhouse who couldn't be taken down. With Isabel's schemes exposed, Victoria used the momentum to further her own ambitions, building alliances and expanding her influence. One evening, As she sat in her office, Nathan called her. "You did it," he said. "She's finished." Victoria allowed herself a small smile. "She underestimated me. That was her first mistake." "And her second?" Nathan asked. "Thinking I'd play fair," Victoria replied smoothly. #### Isabel's downfall. Isabel disappeared from the public eye. Her career was over, her connections severed, and her reputation in ruins. Some said she left the city entirely, retreating to obscurity. Others whispered that she was planning a comeback, though few believed it possible. But Victoria didn't care. The game was over and she had won. #### Epilogue. Months later, Victoria stood at a lavish event, surrounded by powerful allies and admirers. She had risen even higher, her victory over Isabel cementing her position as a force to be reckoned with. As she sipped her champagne, she reflected on the war she had fought and won. Isabel had been a formidable opponent, but in the end, Victoria's precision and foresight had made all the difference. The game had been brutal, but Victoria had no regrets. In her world, there were no prizes for second place, and no mercy for those who dared to challenge her. How did you like the story? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks.